At 3:15 in the morning, something pressed its hand against the outside of my tent. Not knocked, not scratched, pressed. Slow and deliberate, fingers spread wide, pushing the nylon inward with a steady, patient weight. I could see the entire outline, palm, knuckles, the spread of each finger, backlit by whatever thin moonlight was reaching the ridge. The shape was large, larger than any hand I'd seen on a person. And whatever was on the other side of that fabric didn't make a sound. Not a footstep, not a breath drawn against the cold. Just that hand, holding its full shape against the wall of my tent, like it was measuring something on the other side. I've been backpacking alone for over a decade, mostly out in the desolation wilderness in California. I know those granite ridges and pine corridors the way most people know their own neighborhood, every creek crossing, every reliable campsite, every stretch of exposed trail where the afternoon wind comes off the lake and cuts straight through your jacket. I've spent hundreds of nights under canvas with nothing between me and the dark. I have never once been the type to lie awake manufacturing threats out of wind and shadows. What happened on the second night of that 4-day trip is the reason I still can't look at a tent wall without watching the seams. Here's what you need to understand before I tell you the rest. When I went outside the next morning, there were no footprints in the dirt, not a single one. I'd set up camp on an elevated ridge I'd used before, good sight lines, stable ground, a clean drop-off on the south side where the granite shelf fell away into the tree line below. I ate dinner at dusk, hung my food bag from the bear cable 20 yards from the tent, and was asleep before 9. The weather was calm. The pines were doing their usual low, unhurried sound in the darkness, the kind of ambient white noise that puts you under in minutes out here. Everything was ordinary in the particular way the deep wilderness is ordinary, a quiet so complete that cities never come close to it. I came fully awake at exactly 3:15. I know the time because checking my watch the instant my eyes open is a habit I developed years ago, when I learned that panic's first move is always to steal your sense of how long something has been happening. There was no sound that woke me. No snap of a branch, no animal moving through the brush below the ridge, no change in the wind. Just the pines. The same sound that had been there when I fell asleep. Something made me look at the tent wall facing the drop-off. The hand was already there when I turned my head. It wasn't moving when I first saw it, just present. Fingers fully extended and spread, pressing the nylon inward toward my face, loading the fabric with a slow and even weight. The tent material has a little give to it, and whatever was applying that pressure understood this. It wasn't forcing the seam or testing for weakness. It was holding the fabric with the particular steadiness of something that wanted to feel what was on the other side without breaking through to it. I've hiked hundreds of miles of real Appalachian Trail country and California backcountry combined, and I want to be honest about what my body did in that moment. It did nothing. Every trained backcountry response I built over a decade, assess, react, move, went completely offline. I lay in my sleeping bag, and I focused on one thing only, keeping my breathing shallow and even. I didn't reach for my headlamp. I didn't move toward the zipper. I didn't make a sound. Whatever was outside wasn't shuffling its feet on the loose dirt and pine duff of the ridge. It wasn't adjusting its balance on the uneven granite surface. It was holding itself with no weight at all against the terrain, and the brush on the slope below the tent wall was perfectly, impossibly silent. A bear investigates a camp with its nose first and its body second. You hear it coming for 100 yards. A person, even a very still person, breathes hard after climbing to a ridgeline camp in the cold dark. This thing was carrying no sound with it at all. The hand held its position for close to a full minute. I counted the seconds. Then the pressure eased. Not quickly, slowly, the way a tide goes out. The nylon flattened back toward the tent pole with the gradual loosening of something being deliberately withdrawn, not snatched away. By the time the fabric was smooth again, there had been no other sound. No retreating footsteps on the granite. No brush parting on the slope. No rock shifting under a departing weight. Just absence where the hand had been. I stayed on my back and watched that section of nylon until the sky began to gray through the tent roof. Every time the wind moved the fabric, my entire chest seized. I ran through every explanation I had. A branch caught by the wind had pressed to the tent, the nylon shifting on its stakes, an animal that touched the fabric and froze, and every single one of them collapsed under the weight of that slow, deliberate, 5-fingered pressure. Branches don't spread. Animals don't hold position for 60 counted seconds while a human breathes 6 inches away. People always trade camping scary stories around the fire, but living one is another thing entirely. Because in the stories, there's always evidence, always a footprint, a mark, a trace of contact. When the light was finally full enough to see clearly, I unzipped the door and walked the entire perimeter of the tent. The dirt on the ridge was loose and dry, the kind of surface that holds an impression the way wet concrete does. There was nothing. No depression from a boot sole, no claw mark, no compression where a knee or a palm had braced for the reach. The nylon on that side of the tent wasn't torn or dirty. There was no trace of contact on the fabric at all. I packed my gear in under 20 minutes and hiked back to my car without stopping for breakfast. I still go out into the desolation wilderness. I still sleep in tents on ridgelines because the alternative is letting whatever that was take the backcountry from me, and I'm not willing to do that. But I want you to understand what I do now every single time the wind moves through a campsite and pushes against the wall beside me. I count the seconds. I watch the shape of the fabric. And I wait to see if what's pressing against the outside holds its position or pulls slowly, deliberately away. The archive moves deeper. The next account isn't about something that presses against fabric from outside. It's about an entire forest that changed while no one was watching, and what was speaking inside it when one man finally went back. My grandfather's property sat deep in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas, back a gravel road that shed its pavement about 4 miles before his driveway. I spent the better part of my childhood on that land, and I knew every corner of it, the way you only know a place you discovered gradually, on foot, as a kid with nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. There was a ravine we called the Deep Hollow. It ran maybe a quarter mile along the back of the property, shaded by oak and hickory so old and massive they'd been growing since before anyone in my family was born. It was always cooler down there by a solid 10 degrees. You felt the temperature drop the moment you stepped off the upper ridge and into the shade of those canopies. I knew the smell of that place, wet soil, creekstone, lichen, the particular sweetness of moving water over sandstone in summer. I played in that hollow hundreds of times as a boy. I could have walked it blind, in the dark, and known exactly where I was at every step. My grandfather passed away 3 years after I finished college. The family held the property for a while, unable to agree on what to do with it, before finally deciding to sell. I drove back to Arkansas to walk the land one last time before the papers were signed. I needed to close something in my head, to say goodbye to a place that had shaped a significant part of who I was. What I found in that hollow is why I didn't feel grief on the drive home. I felt something else entirely. Something I still don't have a clean word for. The hike back to the hollow was harder than I remembered. The access trail had gone shaggy and overgrown in the years since my grandfather stopped maintaining it. Chest-high undergrowth, fallen limbs across the path, the kind of slow erasure that happens to a trail when nobody walks it consistently. I pushed through, following the terrain from memory, and arrived at the entrance to the ravine just after mid-morning. The trees were wrong, not subtly wrong. Not in the way that a forest shifts gradually with drought or age or the slow migration of an invasive species. These trees had the wrong profile entirely. Wrong leaf shape, wrong bark texture, branches that articulated at angles I couldn't place against anything in my working knowledge of Ozark flora. I've identified plants in these mountains since I was 8 years old. I know the hardwood species of this region by silhouette alone. These specimens did not belong in Arkansas. I'm not confident they belonged anywhere in this part of the continent. I told myself the hollow had been replanted, some conservation initiative maybe, or an overzealous neighbor running an experiment on the back acreage. It was thin reasoning and some part of me knew it immediately, but I kept walking because I needed an explanation more than I needed to be right. About 40 yards in, all the sound quit. Not gradually, all at once like a switch thrown. The insects, the wind moving through the canopy above the ravine walls, the distant repetitive knock of a woodpecker I'd been tracking by ear for the last 10 minutes. Everything stopped simultaneously. The only thing left was the creek, still running over its stones with complete indifference to whatever the air around it had just done. Then I heard the voice. It was coming from around the bend in the ravine, maybe 60 feet ahead, a human voice, close and conversational, murmuring at a steady pace. The rhythm of someone talking through a thought, pausing, then continuing. I stood completely still and focused everything I had on making out the words. I couldn't catch a single one. Not because the voice was quiet. It was clearly audible, but because the words themselves kept sliding away from comprehension every time I reached for them, the way the specific details of a dream collapse the moment you try to write them down after waking. I waited, fully expecting a hiker to come around that bend. It wasn't hunting season. The property wasn't posted yet. Someone could have wandered in through the back fence line from the adjacent national forest land. But while I stood there waiting, something shifted in me that I still can't fully account for. Not fear, exactly. Something quieter and more complete than fear. The sensation of being utterly irrelevant. Not threatened, just rendered invisible and inconsequential to whatever was present in that ravine. Like I had stepped into a room where something very old had been conducting its business for a very long time, and my arrival registered the same way, a change in barometric pressure registers, noted, filed, and immediately dismissed. I didn't run. There was no urgency in my body pushing me to run. I simply turned around and walked back toward the truck at an ordinary pace, the way you leave a place when you've understood that it no longer belongs to you, if it ever did. We sold the property 2 months later. I signed the papers without going back. If you're looking for true forest horror stories, the ones they don't put in official logs, the ones that never get filed anywhere because there's no category for them, listen to this one carefully, because I've never told this to anyone who didn't immediately reach for a rational explanation. Replanting programs, misidentification, stress affecting perception. I've heard them all, and I've turned each one over carefully because I wanted one of them to hold. The hardwood trees in that hollow were trees I climbed as a child. I know what their bark felt like under my palms. The species I saw at the entrance to that ravine on the day I went back were not the trees I grew up with, and no replanting program operates at that scale, at that depth of a private ravine, without a landowner's knowledge or consent. Whatever is in that hollow has been there longer than my grandfather's deed. Whatever was speaking around that bend has no need of an audience. I walked away from it at a normal pace on a quiet morning, and I genuinely believe, that's exactly what it wanted me to do. I hope the people who bought that property stay on the upper ridge. I hope they find the land beautiful and never feel the need to explore the back acreage. And I hope, if they ever do find the hollow, that the voice around the bend is feeling as indifferent that day as it was feeling when I was there. Indifferent is the best outcome available in that ravine. I'm certain of that now. What's waiting in the next account was found on a 14-mile logging road in New Hampshire where no one goes. It was 11 years old, wearing the wrong clothes for the weather, and it did not need your help. The logging road runs 14 miles into the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire and ends in the middle of nowhere. I've driven it in every season for years. Spring mud, summer dust, the crunch of early frost in October, always on my way to a small, remote creek where the fly fishing is extraordinary and the solitude is absolute. In all those trips, across all those years, I have never passed another vehicle on that road. I have never seen footprints at the turnaround. I have never encountered another human being anywhere along those 14 miles of packed dirt and dense pine shadow. Which is why, when I came around the bend that late May morning and saw the little girl standing at the road's edge, my foot came off the gas before my brain had finished processing what my eyes were delivering. She looked about 11. Plain, light-colored dress, the kind a child might wear to a school photograph. No jacket, no pack, no water bottle. Her shoes were wrong for the terrain in a way that registered immediately. The kind of footwear you put on for an indoor occasion, not for a stretch of logging road at the far end of 14 miles of nothing. The morning air coming off the creek bottoms had been cold enough to put my breath in the air during the drive-in. She was standing there in that dress, as though temperature were a concept that simply didn't apply to her. I've been fishing that creek long enough to understand what it means logistically for a child to be standing at that location. There is no residence within 14 miles. There is no trailhead, no campsite, no structure of any kind between the main road and that turnaround. The nearest town is 40 minutes away on the highway. What I was looking at was not possible under any normal set of circumstances, and the calm expression on her face made it worse, not better. She wasn't distressed. That was the first thing that landed. No tear tracks, no shivering, no wide eyes moving anxiously along the tree line. She was watching my truck roll to a stop with the patient, settled expression of someone who had been expecting exactly this to happen and had simply been waiting for it to catch up. I rolled down my window and asked if she was lost or needed help. She said no, she was fine. I asked where her parents were. She pointed. Not down the road, not toward any specific gap in the tree line, just a loose, confident gesture that somehow communicated absolute certainty rather than vagueness, and told me they were home. I asked her name. She gave me one. An old name, the kind that showed up in census records from the 1880s and had fallen almost entirely out of use before the Second World War. She said it the way you say something you've always been called, not the way a child recites a practiced answer for a stranger. I told her I'd wait with her. The road was too remote, the weather too cold, and she was too young for me to drive away in good conscience. She declined politely, but without any uncertainty. Before I could make the offer a second time, she turned and stepped directly into the dense undergrowth on the right side of the road. No sound, not one branch moved with any audible disturbance. The brush closed around her like water closing over a stone dropped from a height, and she was gone. I sat in the truck for several minutes. Then I drove the remainder of the road out to where I could get a signal and called the local sheriff's department. I gave them the mile marker, the description, the name she'd told me. They sent a deputy to walk the area. Nobody ever called me back with findings. That should have been the end of it. Unsettling, inexplicable, but ultimately someone else's problem to resolve. Except the name she gave me wouldn't release me. There's a reason you hear so many park ranger horror stories coming out of these mountains, and a lot of those stories begin with exactly this kind of small, specific detail that a person can't stop pulling at. I pulled at the name. I found it in historical county records for that region of New Hampshire, attached to a girl who had died in the area in the late 19th century, within a few miles of where that logging road now cuts through the forest. The name was uncommon enough that a coincidental match felt intellectually dishonest. I looked at that record for a long time before I closed the browser. I still drive that road. The fishing is too good to abandon, and I've been going there too long to let one morning change it. But I reorganized my schedule after that May trip. I go in before dawn now, and I am back on the main highway before the light starts going golden and the shadows under the pines stretch long. She told me she was waiting for a friend. I've spent considerable time sitting with that detail, turning it over, testing it against what I know about that road and that forest and the name in those county records. Whether the weight, for her, has any meaningful relationship to the passage of time the rest of us experience. Whether the friend she named ever arrived, or whether she's still standing at that bend in the road on certain mornings, in that light-colored dress, in weather that doesn't touch her. I don't go looking for the answer. Some questions in these mountains are better left as questions. I just make sure I'm off that road before dark. The next account doesn't involve a voice or a figure that moves. It stands completely still on the far side of a clearing in Vermont, and no matter how close you walk toward it, it never becomes anything more than a shape. I've been volunteering on trail maintenance in the Green Mountain National Forest for 6 years. My section runs about 4 miles through mixed hardwood and conifer, and I know every detail of it the way a craftsman knows a familiar tool. Every root crossing, every drainage cut, every exposed ledge where the mud pools after rain and needs a fresh water bar before it erodes the tread. I've walked that trail in mud season and ice and August heat and the flat gray light of November, and I have never once felt uncertain about where I was or what surrounded me. Marker 14 sits at the eastern edge of a clearing, roughly 50 yards across, open sky overhead, the kind of generous space that feels almost startling after hours of close canopied hardwood trail. I've stepped out of that tree line into that clearing probably 200 times over 6 years. I know what it looks like in every season and every light. I only needed to see it wrong once. It was early April, a week after a bad windstorm had pushed a half-dozen trees across my section. I was out with a handsaw and a folding pruner working my way through the debris. The leaves hadn't returned to the hardwoods yet, which meant good light and clear sight lines. I could see across the whole 50-yard opening from the moment I stepped out of the tree line. Someone was standing on the far side of the clearing. My first instinct was entirely ordinary. I raised my hand in a wave. Trail volunteers and hikers acknowledge each other out here. It's a small and friendly community. The figure didn't wave back. That was fine. Plenty of people don't. What wasn't fine was that it wasn't moving at all. No weight shift, no adjustment of a pack strap, no head turn toward the sound of my footsteps on the wet ground. It had the absolute stillness of something that wasn't choosing to be still, but simply was. And the color was wrong. Not dark clothing against a bright background. The shape itself was a flat, uniform black, featureless, textureless, as though someone had cut a human silhouette out of the available light and left the whole standing there on the far grass. I kept walking toward it. I've been in these woods long enough to know that distance plays tricks, that dark gear and shadow and the angle of morning light can conspire to make ordinary things look strange. I told myself that 30 yards, the face and jacket would resolve out of the shadow and it would be some early season hiker who hadn't slept enough. At 30 yards, nothing resolved. The shape was still featureless. Still completely, unnaturally still. Human in outline, shoulders, torso, legs, the suggestion of a head, but wrong in a way that my training and experience couldn't absorb or reframe. My feet stopped without a conscious instruction to stop. Every instinct I had was producing the same output simultaneously, loudly, without ambiguity. Do not go closer. We faced each other across 30 yards of dead April grass. I became acutely aware of my own heartbeat, of the sound of water dripping from the bare branches above the clearing, of the weight of the handsaw in my right hand. Long enough that I became aware I was making a calculation, not consciously, but physically. I won't come closer. You don't come closer. Then I glanced down at my boots for a moment. 1 second, maybe 2, just long enough to break eye contact. When I looked back up, the clearing was empty. The ground was saturated with snowmelt. A person walking away from that position in any direction would have torn the wet leaves and matted grass into considerable noise. I heard nothing. No footsteps, no brush parting at the clearing's edge, no sound of any kind marking a departure. I walked to the spot where it had been standing. The ground was undisturbed, no compression, no footprints, no scuff in the debris. Whatever had been occupying that space left no record of having been there. I packed my tools and hiked back to the trailhead. I didn't work the rest of the day. What I keep returning to, the detail that won't settle no matter how many times I turn it, is the moment I looked away. Something in me had decided, without deliberate reasoning, that holding eye contact was the mechanism keeping it fixed in place. That looking was the thing it needed in order to stay. I think that instinct was correct. And I've spent 6 years trying to determine whether that makes the situation better or worse. I still volunteer on that section. I still walk through that clearing at marker 14, probably 20 times a year. I just don't look away from the far tree line when I cross it. Not anymore. Not for any reason. I haven't seen it again. I don't know if that's because it's gone or because I've been too careful to give it the opening it needs. Something was removed from a hillside on Mount Hood in Oregon, not buried, not moved, not obscured, simply replaced by forest that had no business being there. The next account is about a trail that stopped existing mid-hike. I've been running this 9-mile loop in the Mount Hood National Forest since my father first brought me out here when I was 15. That's over 20 years of this specific trail. 20 years of the same creek crossings, the same exposed ridgeline section where the wind comes off the summit and makes you earn every step. The same sequence of landmarks that tell me exactly where I am and how far I have left. The boulder field on the eastern hillside is visible from nearly a mile out. A full hillside of broken gray rock, fractured and scattered across the slope by some geological event long before anyone was recording geological events in this part of Oregon. It is enormous. It is unmissable, and I have used it as my 4-mile marker on every single hike I've done on this loop. One Tuesday in October, I came around the corner where the boulder field should have appeared above me on the slope, and the hillside was covered in unbroken old-growth forest. Not obscured by fog, not hidden behind vegetation growth. Gone? Replaced by trees that would have required a century to reach that height, growing in a density and arrangement that suggested they had never been interrupted by a field of fractured granite. The boulders weren't there. The clearing wasn't there. The slope looked as though the boulder field had never existed. My phone's offline map showed me standing exactly where I should have been standing. The trail under my feet was unchanged. Everything around me was wrong. I kept moving forward. I've hiked enough miles of real Appalachian Trail and Pacific Northwest backcountry to trust my feet over my eyes when they disagree, and I told myself I'd drifted onto a parallel track through some failure of attention. But the trail surface was identical. Same gravel composition, same worn center line, same erosion pattern on the downhill edge I'd memorized over 2 decades. I was on the correct trail. The correct trail had simply stopped matching the mountain. The path got thinner, then fainter. Then it dissolved entirely somewhere in what should have been the 4th mile, leaving me standing in old-growth timber with no track to follow and no landmark I recognized in any direction. And then, the silence arrived. Not the ordinary silence of a calm forest morning. I know that silence well, and it has texture to it, presence, the small constant sounds of a living system doing its work. This was something else. A silence with a quality that felt structural rather than natural, as though the air itself had been replaced with something that merely looked like air and transmitted no sound, no birds, no wind in the canopy, no insects, no squirrels, no creak of branch against branch. The mountain had gone completely, totally mute, and the absence of those sounds had a physical weight to it, a pressure against the ears that made me hyper-aware of my own breathing. It felt like the forest was waiting. Specifically and deliberately waiting, not for anything, just holding its breath. I turned around and moved back the way I came, faster than good sense on uncertain footing should have allowed. The silence followed me for what felt like 20 minutes of hard walking. Then, stepping over a root I finally recognized from years of passing it, I heard a jay call somewhere in the canopy, then wind, then the creek below the trail. Sound came back all at once, rushing in like air into a vacuum, and I stood there for a moment with my hands on my knees, just breathing. I looked up at the slope above the trail. The boulder field was there. Every rock in its correct position, the fractured pale gray of Mount Hood granite scattered across the hillside exactly as it had been for the entire 20 years I'd been hiking past it. The old-growth forest that had replaced it was simply gone, as completely as the boulders had been gone 20 minutes before. I walked over to the nearest boulder and put my palm flat on the rock. Cold granite, lichen working at the north-facing surfaces, a long, diagonal crack where frost had been patient with it over decades. Real, solid, precisely where it had always been. I've run that loop many times since that October Tuesday. The boulder field has never moved. The trail has never dissolved. The silence has never come back. I don't know which of those two facts is harder to sit with. That it happened, or that it happened cleanly and completely and only once, leaving nothing behind that I can point at or test or measure. The mountain gave me back my trail and my landmarks and my sounds, and it kept whatever it briefly showed me. I think about that Tuesday every time I come around that corner. I think about how long I stood in that silent, pathless, old-growth forest before I understood I needed to turn around, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd kept walking forward instead. Two experienced hikers in Wyoming did everything right. They had the right maps, the right pace, the right landmarks. It didn't help. The next account is about a trail that folded back on itself, and the hours that disappeared when it did. Mark and I have been hiking partners for 11 years. We are not the kind of people who get lost. We plan routes with redundant navigation, we keep pace accurately, we communicate about conditions continuously, and we approach backcountry travel with a kind of systematic discipline that comes from years of doing it seriously and respecting the consequences of doing it poorly. The Wind River Range loop we were running on that trip was one we'd completed twice before. We knew the terrain, the elevation profile, the sequence of landmarks. We had that trail in our bodies. None of it mattered. Around 7:20 on the second morning, Mark stopped to photograph a rock on the right side of the trail. It was a substantial boulder covered in bright orange moss, vivid, almost fluorescent against the gray granite, the kind of color that looks artificially saturated in person. Unusual enough to be worth documenting. He took a couple of shots. I waited. We moved on without much comment. Nothing significant about the moment except the particular color of that moss and the clarity of the morning light on it. We made good time through the rest of the morning. The trail was dry, the weather was cooperative, the conversation was easy. By early afternoon, we were on the final descending stretch back toward the trailhead, a section we both recognized from previous trips, a sequence of switchbacks that delivers you to the parking area with a satisfying sense of completion. I was already thinking about the drive home. We came around the final left-hand bend before the descent. The mossy rock was directly in front of us, same boulder. Same extraordinary orange moss, same shape, same position on the right side of the trail. We were approaching it from the opposite direction, from the angle you'd see it from if you were heading deeper into the backcountry, not returning from it. We had not turned around. We had crossed no junction, taken no alternate route, made no navigational decision that either of us could identify. We had been walking forward continuously. Mark pulled out his phone before either of us said anything. The photograph timestamp said 7:20 in the morning. His phone clock said 2:15 in the afternoon. We had been hiking for nearly 7 hours. We sat down on a log and spent 20 minutes attempting to reconstruct the day's route mentally, checking against each other's recollection, looking for the moment of error. We had been in direct sunlight on a clear trail, talking without interruption for the entire day. There was no fog, no confusing junction, no moment where either of us had felt uncertain or disoriented. We could both account for the morning. The mossy rock at 7:20, breakfast at a creek crossing around 9, the long ridgeline traverse in the late morning. What we could not account for was how any of that sequence had brought us back to a rock we'd passed going in the other direction 6 hours earlier. We re-hiked the section back to the trailhead. When we reached the car and checked the time against our expected arrival window, the math was wrong in a way that had no clean explanation. We had walked continuously for the better part of a day and ended up hours behind where our pace and distance should have put us. There's a specific quality to the feeling of reliable systems failing without explanation. I troubleshoot problems for a living. I'm methodical. I track variables. I test hypotheses. What I experienced sitting on that log in Wyoming with Mark was the cognitive equivalent of watching a calculation produce an impossible result 3 times in a row on a calculator you trust completely. Not panic. Something quieter and more disorienting than panic. The vertigo of understanding that some mechanism you depended on has been running incorrectly and you have no entry point for determining why. We went back the following year. Paper maps, a compass, a written log of every junction and landmark. The hike was exactly what it should have been. Every landmark and sequence, every time check matching our pace, the mossy rock appearing once at 7:20 in the morning from the correct direction and not again. I've thought about that second hike many times. If it had gone wrong again, if we'd found ourselves back at the rock a second time, there would at least be a pattern to investigate. A repeating error suggests a systematic cause. But the second hike was perfect and ordinary, which means there was no consistent variable to identify. What happened on the first trip happened once, under conditions that should have prevented it, and left no trace in the terrain that a return visit could detect. Whatever bent that trail around and dropped us hours into the past did it cleanly and completely and only once, and then it let us go. I'm still not sure whether letting us go was generosity or indifference. I'm not sure it matters. If these true forest horror stories are keeping you awake, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe. We have more unexplained encounters from the deep woods arriving next week. Now, a woman was singing a pioneer hymn in a remote slot canyon in Utah. The voice recorder picked up everything in that canyon perfectly. Everything except her voice. I've spent most of my adult life hunting old foundations and abandoned settlement sites across the Utah backcountry. I'm not casual about it. I research locations through historical documents, survey records, county deed archives, old land maps held in university collections. I don't wander and hope. I go to specific coordinates with specific reasons, and I document what I find with the care of someone who understands that these sites are finite and fragile. The 1920s land survey I'd tracked down in a Salt Lake archive mentioned a small homestead cabin situated in a remote slot canyon in Zion's backcountry. A family named in a single paragraph, a rough bearing from a named wash, the notation that the structure sat near a spring on the canyon's upper end. By the time I hiked out there on a Wednesday in late May, there was obviously nothing structural left. I was looking for the foundation depression, some scatter of worked stone, a sense of how the family had oriented their lives against the canyon walls. I found the site without much difficulty. An overgrown rectangular depression in the canyon floor, some tumbled sandstone that had once been coursed into walls, a slight discoloration in the soil where a hearth might have been. I spent a while photographing the layout and taking some measurements. That's when the singing started. It came from further up the canyon, a woman's voice, clear and full and unhurried, singing a pioneer hymn with complete lyrics. Not humming, not fragments. The entire song, rendered with the natural ornamentation of someone who had sung it so many times, the embellishments had become unconscious. I know historical folk music well enough to recognize the genre immediately. The style was authentic to the period. The voice was genuinely beautiful. The kind of voice that carries in an enclosed stone space with a clarity that feels almost architectural. I pulled my digital recorder from my vest pocket, hit record, and began moving carefully toward the sound. I kept expecting the volume to shift as I navigated around the canyon's bends, to fade as I moved wrong, or increase as I closed the distance. Instead, it held at exactly the same level regardless of my position. I moved 40 feet closer to the upper bend, and the voice was neither louder nor softer than it had been at the foundation site. Sound in a slot canyon behaves in particular ways, bouncing and channeling between the walls, but this wasn't behaving that way. It was simply present, at a fixed volume, independent of my movement toward it. I came around the canyon bend. The singing stopped in the middle of a word, a hard, clean cut, not a breath pause, not a natural phrase ending. The voice was simply present, and then was not, leaving the canyon in a silence that felt almost pressurized after the sound. I stood in the upper canyon for 5 minutes waiting for the voice to resume. Then I searched everything accessible, looked for footprints in the sandy canyon floor, a campsite, a fire ring, any sign of a living person who had recently occupied that space. Slot canyon floors hold impressions exceptionally well. There was nothing. Not a boot print, not a disturbed stone, not a food wrapper or a tent stake impression. I hiked out that evening with the recorder in my vest and a feeling I couldn't fully name. Not quite fear, not quite exhilaration. Something in between, with a quality of unfinished business to it. I plugged the recorder into my laptop when I got home and pulled up the audio file. 17 minutes of recording, beginning at the foundation site and ending after I'd searched the upper canyon. My footsteps were on the track. The wind moving through the canyon walls was on the track. The ambient birds and the sound of my breathing during the search were all present with clear fidelity. During the 6 minutes when the woman had been singing, the audio was clean silence, no voice, no interference or dropout. The file was technically flawless. A sound engineer I trust confirmed this after examining the waveform carefully. The microphone had been functioning perfectly. It had captured every other sound in that canyon with precision. It had captured nothing where the singing was. A sound engineer will tell you what the physics already imply. If a sound doesn't register on a quality recorder with a functioning microphone in an open environment, it isn't producing physical sound waves. It is not disturbing air molecules in the way that all audible sound requires. Whatever I followed up that canyon for 40 feet was real to my auditory system. I adjusted my pace based on its direction. I experienced it as fully present, external, and directional. My recorder experienced a quiet afternoon in an empty slot canyon. I've been back to Zion's backcountry many times since that Wednesday. I still explore historical sites. I still carry the recorder. But I haven't returned to that specific canyon, and I want to be honest about why. It isn't the singing that keeps me away. It's the question the recorder raised about the nature of what I heard, and what that implies about the woman it belonged to, and whether she understood I was there, and what she made of me standing 40 feet away in the silence after her voice cut off. I don't think I want to find out. The next account comes from a wildlife biologist with 30 years of field experience in Olympic National Park. She has identified the vocalizations of every large mammal in that forest. What she recorded during her overnight survey matched none of them, and the tracks it left behind were impossible. 30 years of fieldwork, 30 years of trail cameras and track stations and behavioral surveys and peer-reviewed publications that other researchers cite. I can identify a black bear by its gait pattern on a camera trap. I can distinguish an elk bugle by the specific break in the upper register. I know what every large mammal in the Olympic Peninsula sounds like when it moves through wet undergrowth at midnight, and I know what it sounds like when it decides to stop moving. I know what a cougar sounds like when it's curious about a tent. I know what a Roosevelt elk sounds like when it's alarmed. I want you to understand the specificity of that experience before I tell you what I recorded during a routine overnight survey in Olympic National Park in Washington, because I need the baseline to be clear. I am not someone who misidentifies sources. I am not susceptible to suggestion or atmospheric anxiety. I have slept alone in this forest more nights than I can calculate, in conditions ranging from perfect calm to active windstorm, and I have never once confused what I was hearing with something it wasn't. What I heard that night was not any animal in my 30 years of field experience. It was seed drop season, which drives significant animal activity. Bears covering ground aggressively before denning, deer and smaller mammals responding to the food availability, the whole system running hotter and more nocturnal than usual. I was in my tent around midnight, reviewing trail camera footage on my laptop by the light of the screen, when the sound started from the muddy flat approximately 100 yards northeast of camp. Low frequency. Deep enough to register in the sternum before the ears fully processed it. A rhythmic pulse to the sound. Not quite vocalization, not quite mechanical vibration, something occupying the border between the two categories in a way my training had no file for. It was so far below the normal frequency range of large mammal vocalizations that my first instinct was to look for an environmental source, a distant generator, seismic activity, wind resonating in a particular formation. I ruled each of those out within the first minute of listening. Whatever was producing the sound was staying in one position. For 8 minutes, as I recorded it on my phone, the source did not move. Not a footstep, not a shift of weight, not a single twig deflection in the brush surrounding the flat. The sound simply pulsed from a fixed point in the dark, steady and unhurried, with a quality my nervous system kept translating as too large, before my training could override the interpretation. In the morning, I broke camp and walked to the flat. The mud was perfect, soft and detailed from recent rain, exactly the kind of surface I use for track identification work. The tracks were there. Flat-footed, plantigrade in arrangement, bearing a general structural similarity to a bear's print. But the scale was wrong in ways that my experience told me immediately were not artifacts of soil compression or tracking angle. The stride length implied a mass and height that my field guides had no entry for. The depth of the impressions in that soft mud told a story about weight that I kept recalculating because I didn't want to accept the first result. I photographed everything, documented the stride measurements, packed my equipment, and drove back to the university. I played the audio for 4 colleagues whose combined field experience spans more species and more geography than I can easily calculate. None of them identified the source. An audio analyst determined that the frequency characteristics of the recording fell outside the documented vocalization range for any known North American mammal. The recording itself was clean, no artifact, no distortion, no technical explanation for the anomaly. There is a reason I haven't submitted this evidence through formal channels, and I want to be direct about it. My name is attached to more than 20 peer-reviewed publications. I have built a professional reputation over 3 decades of rigorous, documented, reproducible fieldwork. The moment I put it on record that I have audio and physical track evidence I cannot classify within any known species framework, the conversation stops being about the evidence and becomes about me. I have watched that happen to other researchers. I know exactly how it unfolds. The file is on my phone. I've backed up the photographs in multiple locations. I look at the stride measurements sometimes late at night and run the arithmetic again. The way you return to a calculation you must have gotten wrong somewhere in the steps. The arithmetic always produces the same answer. Whatever left those tracks in the mud of that flat is still somewhere in the forest of Olympic National Park. It was there long before my survey program began. It will be there long after I retire. It produces a sound that resonates in human chests and leaves footprints that my 30 years of training cannot place in any known taxonomy. And it stood completely still for 8 minutes in the dark while I listened to it from inside my tent, close enough that the sound moved through my sternum like a second heartbeat. I still do field work in those woods. I just sleep differently now, with a particular alertness I didn't have before, the alertness of a researcher who knows she has an open question that she cannot close through any methodology currently available to her. The question is still open. I expect it will remain that way. The next account doesn't involve anything moving through the forest. It involves something that was already inside a locked truck on a mountain road in Colorado, and a smell that had no source and left no trace. I'm a structural engineer. My professional life is built entirely on the principle that effects have identifiable causes, that causes leave evidence, and that evidence yields to rigorous analysis if you're disciplined enough in how you approach it. I have spent my career finding the failure point in structures that other people said were sound. I don't accept unexplained as a final answer. I keep working the problem until the variables resolve into something coherent. I have been working this particular problem for 3 years. It is not resolved, and I've come to understand that this specific failure, my inability to find the cause, bothers me more than the event itself ever did. The weekend in the San Juan National Forest in Colorado was entirely unremarkable. Solo camping trip, 2 nights, the kind of restorative silence that reminds you why you drive 4 hours into the mountains when the city starts compressing your thinking. I broke camp on Sunday morning, loaded my gear efficiently into the bed of my truck, and started the long drive back out on the dirt road. It was cold enough that my breath fogged when I stepped outside. The kind of sharp, clean cold that the San Juans produce in the morning before the sun gets over the ridge. Windows up, heater running, cab sealed against the temperature. About 15 minutes down the road, the smell hit from the back seat. I want to be precise here because the precision is the point. I have been outdoors my entire life. I know what decomposition smells like, what wet animal fur smells like, what a dead rodent in an enclosed space smells like after varying amounts of time. This was none of those things in degree or character. The closest description I can assemble is this. Imagine the smell of a large, wild, heavily furred animal, not dead, not sick, but intensely, overwhelmingly alive, layered over something that had no biological reference point for me. Something older. Something that didn't smell like an animal so much as it smelled like the deep ground the animal came from. It was so abrupt and so total that it made me gag behind the steering wheel. I braked hard, pulled to the road's edge, and got all 4 doors open before the truck had fully stopped rocking. I checked everything. Under the seats, the cargo area behind the rear bench, the floor mats, the gap beside the spare tire. No animal, no carcass, no organic material of any kind. The back seat was clean. My truck had been locked since I'd finished loading it that morning, and I'd been sitting in the cab for 15 minutes before the smell arrived. I was certain of this because a smell that density doesn't build gradually. You notice it building. This one arrived fully formed, at maximum intensity, from nothing. I stood outside in the cold for several minutes, letting the cab air. Then I drove on. By the time I reached the main highway, the smell had faded completely, not diminished, gone. No residual quality in the upholstery, no trace in the air movement from the vents, absent as completely and abruptly as it had arrived. My brother's mouse in the vents hypothesis doesn't survive contact with the evidence. A decomposing mouse does not produce an odor of that magnitude or that specific character, and more importantly, a dead animal in a vehicle's heating system leaves a trail in the vent output in a smell that persists for days regardless of ventilation. This left nothing. Whatever produced that musk was present and then was not, on a timeline measured in minutes, inside a sealed and moving vehicle on a mountain road. Here is the specific detail that defeats every model I construct, and I've built quite a few over 3 years of returning to this problem. My truck was locked, the windows were up, the cab was sealed against a freezing mountain morning. Whatever generated that smell, something of sufficient biological mass to produce an odor that overwhelming, was physically inside the vehicle with me, not outside the window, not carried on outside air entering through a vent. Inside the cab, in the back seat. I've driven that same mountain road a dozen times since that Sunday morning. The smell has never come back. Part of my engineering brain wants to treat that as evidence of a one-time anomaly, an outlier, a single unrepeatable data point, something to acknowledge and set aside. Single data points without a pattern don't constitute a phenomenon. But the larger part of me, the part that cannot stop running variables, keeps arriving at the same conclusion. Something got into my truck in the San Juan National Forest while it was locked and parked, traveled with me for 15 minutes of mountain road, and then departed without opening a door or leaving any physical evidence of its presence. Whatever it was, it knew how to leave without being caught leaving. That kind of deliberateness, in anything that produces a biological scent, implies something I don't have a professional framework for and can't put in a report. It keeps me awake. Being an engineer who cannot solve the problem that's sitting right in front of him is a specific and persistent kind of misery. I still don't have an answer. I'm starting to believe I won't get one. The last account tonight comes from a backyard in New York where the woods begin 60 yards from the house. Whatever stands at the tree line every autumn has been there for 3 years. It has never crossed onto the property, and the man who lives there has learned to live with it, because this has been his home for 40 years, and he isn't leaving. I've lived in the same house on the edge of the Adirondacks in New York for 40 years. My children were raised in its rooms. My wife and I have watched 4 decades of seasons move across the same view from the back porch, the lawn sloping gently down to the old stone wall, and then beyond it, the deep, dark line of the forest beginning where the mowed grass ends. I know that tree line the way I know my own face in a mirror. Every gap between trunks, every dead birch gone silver and skeletal, every shadow that appears and shifts and disappears as the light changes through the day. I have 40 years of that view memorized down to the specific quality of its darkness at dusk. 3 years ago in October, a new shape appeared at the tree line. It has come back every autumn since, and my wife and I have learned to live with it, the way you learn to live with a neighbor you don't understand and can't reason with, and have decided not to provoke. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I am not a person who is easily unsettled. I've hunted these woods for 30 years. I know what moves in the dark at the edge of that forest, and I know its shapes and sounds well enough to read them from a porch chair with a beer in my hand. What I saw standing at the tree line that first October evening was not anything I could read. The light was going flat and gray, the way it does in the Adirondacks when the sun drops behind the ridge to the west and the temperature follows it down quickly. I was on the back porch, watching the last color leave the sky, when I noticed the shape at the boundary of the lawn in the woods. My first thought was deer, a large deer standing at the tree line watching the yard. I've seen hundreds of deer at that boundary over 40 years. But a deer's silhouette at 60 yards has a particular quality: the horizontal weight of the body, the fragility of the legs, the way the head moves with that constant nervous readjustment. This shape was vertical, completely vertical, and completely still, and the shoulders were wrong for anything with 4 legs. I watched it for the rest of the evening light. It didn't move, not a weight shift, not a head turn toward my porch. The absolute, deliberate stillness of something that had chosen its position carefully and intended to hold it. When full dark came, I went inside and said nothing to my wife. The second night, the shape was in the same spot. By the end of the first week, I understood what I was dealing with, or rather, I understood that I was not going to be able to explain it away, which is a different kind of understanding and a harder one to sit with. It came at dusk, reliably. It stood in the same gap between the same 2 birch trees, oriented toward the house. It stayed until the darkness absorbed it, and I never heard it leave. I got out my hunting binoculars on the 9th evening and steadied them on the shape with enough evening light remaining to see clearly. Good optics, magnification that resolves a deer's facial features at 200 yards. There was no face, not in shadow, not obscured by the distance or the failing light. The shape itself was a uniform, textureless dark, a human outline, shoulders and torso, and a suggestion of a head, filled entirely with a darkness that didn't match the surrounding dark of the forest behind it. Not a person standing in shadow. The shape was the darkness, complete and absolute, and it was watching the house. I called my neighbor over the following week without telling him what to expect. I asked him to look at the tree line and tell me what he saw. He saw it within 30 seconds. He wanted to take a flashlight out there and walk up to it. I told him no, firmly, and I told him not to go near the property line. The boundary is the thing that matters. I understood this before I could articulate it, and 3 years of careful observation have confirmed it with the consistency of a documented pattern. The figure holds position at the precise edge where my lawn meets the forest. It has never stepped onto the grass. In 3 years and every autumn since, it has maintained that line with a consistency that does not feel accidental. As long as we don't cross toward it, it doesn't cross toward us. That's the understanding I've arrived at. I can't prove it's intentional on the figure's part, but I've treated it as a rule, and the rule has held. My wife has seen it clearly enough now to have her own relationship with it. Not comfortable exactly, but no longer frightening in the acute way it was the first season. We don't discuss it much. There isn't a great deal to say that we haven't already covered. It's there. It watches. It respects the line. We respect the line. The arrangement persists. People ask why we don't sell the house and move. I've thought about the answer carefully over 3 years, and it always arrives at the same place. This house has been my home for 40 years. My children's heights are marked on the kitchen door frame going back to when they were 3 years old. I have no interest in being displaced from 40 years of my life by something that has, to this point, kept its agreement. But here is what I think about on the nights when sleep won't come and the October wind is moving through the trees outside the window. I have never stood at the property line after dark. I have never walked to the gap between those two birch trees and looked back toward the house from the position where the figure stands. I don't know what the house looks like from there. I don't know what we look like from 60 yards away, through lit windows, in the dark. I don't know what it's watching for. I don't know what it's waiting to see. I've observed it for 3 years, and I still can't determine whether its attention is a threat or something else entirely, something that doesn't map onto any category I have available. It's out there right now, probably, in the October air, in the gap between the birch trees, holding its position with that absolute and patient stillness, looking at the lit windows of a house where two people have learned to sleep with something watching from the tree line. I still believe the arrangement holds. I believe it a little less every October. And some nights I sit on the back porch in the dark, and I look at the tree line, and I wonder if it's still there even when I can't see it. I wonder if the darkness itself, in that specific gap between those specific trees, is different from the darkness everywhere else along that line. I've never gone out there to check. I don't think I ever will. That's all 10 stories for tonight. If you've seen something in the mountains or the deep woods that you can't explain, leave it in the comments. We read everyone. Subscribe to the channel. Never hike alone.